You already know this story. You lived some version of it. The pressure at 17, 18 years old, the family staring at you across the dinner table, the bishop asking uncomfortable questions in a private office, the feeling that your entire worth inside that community was tied to one decision: are you going or not? What is new is this: a growing number of young Latter-day Saints are saying no, and the church, for all its carefully worded press releases and carefully managed statistics, is having a very hard time hiding it. If you grew up in the church, if you served a mission, if you left, and you want to understand what is actually happening to the next generation, this video is for you. Subscribe if you want more of this. We are pushing toward 1,000 subscribers, and this channel exists because of people who, like you, are done being given the approved version of the story. Let's talk about what the data actually shows. 1. The church says, the numbers are fine. They are not. Every April, the church releases its statistics at General Conference, and every year the PR machine does the same thing. It leads with the headline numbers. In 2023, approximately 71,000 full-time missionaries serving worldwide. They will tell you that is up from 67,000 in 2022. They will not tell you it is still recovering from the crash to 53,000 in 2020, when missionaries were quietly sent home during COVID because the institutional infrastructure couldn't hold. But even those numbers, taken at face value, are misleading. Because the church has not published, and has actively avoided publishing, the ratio that actually matters. What percentage of eligible young adults are choosing to serve compared to a decade ago, compared to 2 decades ago, compared to the size of the youth population the church claims to have? Here is what independent researchers have found. Scholar Jana Reese spent years tracking what she calls the next generation of Mormons. Her conclusion, backed by surveys and demographic data, is that roughly half of people raised in the LDS Church are no longer active members by adulthood. Half. That is not a rounding error, that is a hemorrhage. The church grew its raw missionary numbers in 2013 by doing something clever. It lowered the eligibility age from 19 to 18 for men. Overnight, numbers jumped nearly 30%. The PR looked great. What it actually did was pull forward a wave of teenagers before they had time to sit with their doubts. The bounce was artificial, and the church has been trying to maintain that artificial baseline ever since. The real number the church does not want you focused on is this: it claims 17 million members worldwide. But outside researchers, including sociologist David Stewart, who has studied LDS growth patterns for decades, estimate that active attending membership is closer to 4 to 5 million globally. The gap between claimed membership and real participation is one of the largest of any major religious institution in the world. And it is getting wider, not smaller. More missionaries? Sure. But missionaries drawn from a shrinking pool of young people who actually believe what they are being sent out to say. 2. Gen Z grew up with Wi-Fi. The church did not plan for that. When you were growing up in the church, information was controlled. What you knew about LDS history was what the institution decided you should know. Correlation Committee approved curriculum, manuals that told the version of Joseph Smith that made the story work. You had to be very motivated and very persistent to find anything else. Most kids weren't. Most adults weren't either. Gen Z has never lived in that world. A 16-year-old in Provo today can find, in a single afternoon on their phone, the documented history of Joseph Smith's polyandry, meaning he married women who were already married to other living men. The fact that the Book of Abraham papyri were recovered in 1966, and Egyptologists immediately confirmed they have nothing to do with what Smith claimed to translate from them. The multiple, contradictory versions of the first vision that Smith told at different points in his life. The CES letter, a document written by a former seminary teacher that catalogs these problems systematically and has now been read by millions. The church's response to this, the so-called Gospel Topics essays published starting in 2013, were an attempt at damage control. And if you read them carefully, they are actually extraordinary documents, not because they are honest, but because of how artfully they are not. They acknowledge the problems in language so hedged, so passive, so carefully constructed to minimize alarm, that a teenager reading them for the first time would have to work hard to understand what is actually being admitted. And Gen Z is reading both. They are reading the sanitized institutional version and the raw historical record. They are comparing them, and they are noticing that the two do not match. That process, and the rage and grief that comes with it, is called a faith crisis. But a more accurate name for it might be finally being told the truth. You ask a young person who has been through that process to go knock on doors in another country and tell strangers the church is the one true restored gospel of Jesus Christ. You are asking them to perform a conviction they no longer have, and a growing number of them are not willing to do it. 3. The pressure machine is losing its grip. For decades, the missionary system ran on a specific kind of social coercion. It was never called that. It was called testimony and preparation and blessing. But the mechanism was simple. In a tight-knit Mormon community, not going on a mission meant something. It meant people whispered. It meant your parents had to explain to their ward friends. It meant your dating prospects inside the community narrowed. It meant you were quietly categorized as less faithful, less serious, less worthy. That machine depended on the community being the primary social world for every young person inside it. And it is falling apart for a simple reason. It is no longer the primary social world for most of them. Gen Z has TikTok, Reddit, Discord, YouTube. They have friend groups that extend far outside the ward. They have access to ex-Mormon communities where people who went through exactly what they are going through are openly talking about it. The shame radius of the church has shrunk dramatically. The American Psychological Association has documented that Gen Z reports higher rates of anxiety and depression than any generation on record. But this generation is also more likely than any before it to name manipulation when they see it. They grew up watching adults gaslight each other on social media. They are acutely, sometimes exhaustingly, attuned to the gap between what an institution says and what it does. They have a word for it now, performative, and they apply it to the mission with increasing frequency. The cost of going also cannot be ignored. Families pay approximately $500 a month for a 2-year mission, $12,000 total, minimum. In a housing crisis, with student debt at record levels and economic anxiety running highest in this generation, that is a real sacrifice with a real price tag. Being paid to send a teenager out to teach something they may privately no longer believe. 4. The ones who do go, many come back and leave. Anyway, here is the part the church absolutely does not want in any press release. A significant portion of the young people who go on missions, who comply, who put on the white shirt, who get on the plane, come home and leave the church within a few years anyway. The retention data on returned missionaries is one of the most closely guarded institutional secrets in Salt Lake City. The church does not publish it. It has never published it. But independent surveys, including Reese's work and multiple studies conducted through university religious demography programs, consistently show that the idea of the mission as a faith-cementing, lifetime retention tool is no longer reliably true for this generation. The pattern is recognizable to anyone who has lived it or watched someone close to them live it. You go. You suppress everything for 2 years. You come home. The structure evaporates. You are back in your childhood bedroom with no companion, no schedule, no mission president telling you what to do next. And all the questions you shelved because you were too busy tracting, they come back. They have been sitting in a pile the entire time. And now you have nothing to do but look at them. In Mormon culture, this is called the shelf breaking. The shelf is the mental place where you put all the things that don't fit. And every time you go to testimony meeting and say you know the church is true when part of you doesn't, the shelf gets heavier. Missions don't empty the shelf. They overload it. And the crash, when it comes, is proportional to how long you held on. Some of the youngest, most aware members of Gen Z have watched this happen to the generation just ahead of them. They have seen the older sibling go, come back changed in ways that were never fully explained, quietly stop attending. And they are running their own calculation before they commit. 5. The church can print all the numbers it wants. It is losing a generation. The LDS Church is very good at one thing above all others, managing its own narrative. It has a public affairs department, a media team, a PR infrastructure that would be the envy of a Fortune 500 company. And the story it tells about itself is one of steady, confident growth. More temples, more missionaries, more members. But there are cracks that no PR department can fully paper over. The church has been quietly closing meeting houses in the United States and consolidating wards, meaning combining multiple congregations because there are no longer enough active members to sustain them separately. This is happening in Utah. It is happening in Idaho. It is happening in communities that were solid Mormon country a generation ago. The pattern that demographers who study religious retention call the Great De-Churching is hitting the LDS Church harder among young people than the institution's official messaging will ever acknowledge. And the missionary program, which for generations served as the primary mechanism for socializing young adults into lifetime commitment, is no longer reliably producing that outcome. What the church is experiencing is not a temporary dip, it is a structural problem. The information environment that allowed it to control its own history for over a century no longer exists. The social pressure infrastructure that made non-compliance genuinely costly is weakening every year. And the generation it most needs to capture, the teenagers and 20-somethings who will either become the next wave of missionaries, tithing-paying adults, and institutional loyalists, or won't, is the most information-literate, the most manipulation-resistant, and the most connected to post-Mormon communities of any generation in the church's history. You can have rising missionary numbers and still be losing a generation. You can build temples in every city and still be watching the people inside them get older and fewer. The metric the church measures is not the metric that matters. If you grew up inside this system, you know exactly what the cost of that social pressure felt like. You know what it means to sit in a bishop's interview at 17 and feel the weight of an entire community's expectation pressing down on a decision that was supposed to be yours. You know what it means to go, or to not go, and live with either choice in a community that made both feel like a verdict on your soul. What is different now is that Gen Z has language for what was done to them. They have communities of people who got out and are talking about it. They have access to the history the church spent a century managing. And a growing number of them are refusing to pass that system on to the next generation by participating in it. The church will call this apostasy. It will call it weakness, or worldliness, or the influence of anti-Mormon propaganda. What it actually is a generation that grew up with better access to the truth than any before it, and is making a different choice. The real crisis in LDS missionary culture is not a recruitment problem. It is a credibility problem, and no policy change, no age adjustment, no new temple announcement is going to fix a credibility problem. You fix a credibility problem with honesty. And that is the one thing this institution has never been willing to offer. Subscribe if this is the kind of conversation you want more of. Leave a comment. I want to know if you served, if you left, if you watched your kids go through this. Every story matters, and I read all of them. See you in the next one.